Hi, welcome to Chapter 2, The Biological Perspective. This is Mr. Emmer, your adjunct psychology instructor. We're going to cover the biological perspective of the central nervous system, brain, spinal cord, and neural network. And this is pretty dry stuff, so I actually added some other links, which is a little more interesting than covering these PowerPoints. But I'm still going to cover the PowerPoints if you wanted to follow the structure of your textbook. These are the objectives. I'm not going to read them to you. You can read them in the non-narrated version of the PowerPoint. First of all, let's talk about the overview of the nervous system. The nervous system is an extensive network of specialized cells that carry information to and from all parts of the body. The neuroscience deals with the structure and function of neurons, nerves, and nervous tissue. It also studies the relationship to behavior and learning. If you want to watch interesting video that's in your book under my psych lab, it's the brain's role in our behavior. First of all, the basic cell that makes up the nervous system and receives and sends messages in that system is called the neuron. The parts of the neuron are the dendrites, which are branch-like structures that receive messages from other neurons, the soma, the cell body of the neuron responsible for maintaining the life of the cell, the axon, which is long tube-like structure that carries the neural messages to other cells. There's a little video that explains the structure of the neuron if you want to see that. This is a little graph of the structure of the neuron. Notice axon terminals at the ends of the axon communicate with other nerve cells. Glial cells are gray fatty cells that provide support for the neurons to grow on and around. They deliver nutrients to neurons and produce myelin to coat the axons. Myelin involves fatty substances produced by certain glial cells that coat the axons of neurons to insulate, protect, and speed up the neural impulse. They clean up waste products and dead neurons. In the disease of multiple sclerosis, the myelin sheath is destroyed, which leads to diminished loss of neural functioning in those damaged cells. Ions are charged particles. Now, inside the neuron, it's negatively charged. Outside the neuron, it's positively charged. The resting potential is when the state of the neuron is not firing a neural impulse. Action potential is when a stimulus causes a release of the neural impulse, consisting of reversal of the electrical charge within the axon. This allows positive sodium ions to enter the cell. So in the resting state, it's a negatively charged state. With the stimulus, it makes the neuron fire, and the ion channel is reversed. Also, it's an all or none type deal, where a neuron fires either completely or does not fire at all, and then it returns to its resting potential. This is a graph that shows the neuron impulse action potential, where it's at rest, and then where there's an impulse, and the impulse continues. The sodium ions along the potassium ions move outside the membrane. This also shows the resting potential and how after the stimulus it enters into the action potential and then returns back to the resting potential. During that time, it sends the message to other cells. Axon terminals are the rounded areas at the end of the branches at the end of the axon. It's responsible for communicating with the other nerve cells. The synaptic vesicles are sac-like structures that contain chemicals found inside the axon terminal. The neurotransmitter is a chemical found in the synaptic vesicles, which when released has an effect on the next cell. The synaptic gap is when microscopic microscopic fluid-filled space between the rounded areas at the end of the axon terminals of one cell and the dendrites or surface of the next cell. The receptor sites are holes in the surface of the dendrites or certain cells of the muscles and glands, and they're shaped only to fit certain neurotransmitters. Here's a picture that shows the synaptic vesicles that are released with the nerve impulse, and the surface of the postsynaptic neuron, which has receptor sites which will accept certain vesicles and reject others. Now, neurons must be turned on and off. The excitatory neurotransmitter is a neurotransmitter that causes the receiving cell to fire. An inhibitory neurotransmitter is a transmitter that causes the receiving cell to stop firing. So transmitters will either be excitatory or inhibitory. Now, chemical substances can affect neuronal communication. Now, agonists mimic or experience or enhance the effects of neurotransmitter on a receptor site of the next cell, increasing or decreasing the activity of that cell. To get an idea of an agonist, the black widow venom can mimic or enhances effects of neurotransmitters. It'll actually speed up the effects of neurotransmitters, can cause a person to go into convulsions. Where an antagonist chemical, it blocks or reduces a cell's response to the action of other chemicals or neurotransmitters. For instance, the South American blow darts, curare, blocks effects of neurotransmitters and causes paralysis, and that would be a chemical substance that would be antagonist. This shows some different neurotransmitters and their functions. ACH is excitatory or inhibitory, and it's involved in arousal, attention, memory. Neopinephrine is mainly excitatory. It's involved in arousal and mood change. Dopamine is excitatory or inhibitory, but it's involved in the control of movement and sensations of pleasure. Serotonin is excitatory or inhibitory, and it's involved in sleep, mood, and appetite. GABA, amylobutyric acid, is major inhibitory transmitter involved in sleep and inhibits movement. Glutamate is a major excitatory transmitter involved in learning, memory formation, nervous system development, and synaptic plasticity. And then there's endorphins, which is an inhibitory neuroregulator. It's involved in pain relief. So endorphins are a natural pain reliever, also known as endogenous morphine or natural pain relievers. This is why opiates are so addictive, because what they do is when people take morphine or heroin, their body neglects to produce endorphins. So when the drug wears off, there's no protection from pain at all, and in essence everything hurts because the body stopped producing endorphins, which leads to the psychological and physical addiction to the drug. Let's talk about cleaning up the synapse. So there's what's called reuptake, which is a process by which neurotransmitters are taken back to the synaptic vesicles. This process is kind of like a vacuum cleaner or a suction tube, and it sucks up the chemicals back up into the presynaptic system. It's a process of clearing the receptor site for the next stimulation. For instance, cocaine, it blocks dopamine to the reuptake sites, allowing dopamine to stay active in the synapses longer. An enzyme is another way of cleaning up the synapses. It's a complex protein that's manufactured by cells. It specifically breaks up the acetylcholine because muscle activity needs to happen rapidly. Reuptake is basically too slow. There's a video here that shows a little bit about that process. So here shows the process of the reuptake of dopamine. So after the synaptic process, these chemicals need to be uptaked, or an enzyme is released to get rid of those extra amounts of dopamine. This shows how cocaine blocks the dopamine reuptake sites, and so the dopamine is allowed in the synapse for a lot longer time. So overview of the nervous system. Basically, if you look, there's two major parts. There's the central nervous system, which involves the brain and the spinal cord. And then there's a peripheral nervous system, and that's everything besides the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, it involves the autonomic nervous system, which handles body functions, the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division, which has to do with reacting to different situations. Sympathetic is in times of stress. Parasympathetic is during times of normal times, saving energy. And then the somatic nervous system has to do with basically the motor system and the sensory system. Okay, and we'll explain a little bit more about this. Sensory system sends messages to the spinal cord and to the brain. It's called the efferent, where the motor system is where the brain or the spinal cord is sending messages to the muscles. So the central nervous system is part of the nervous system involving the brain and spinal cord. And the spinal cord is a long bundle of neurons that carries messages from the body to the brain, and it's responsible for very fast life-saving reflexes. This is kind of cool, the spinal cord reflex. For instance, if you put your finger on a candle, the flame will stimulate pain receptors, and then a sensory neuron will actually go directly to your spinal cord. Okay, so instead of this message going to your brain saying, hey, your finger's on fire, it goes immediately to your spinal cord. The spinal cord sends a message immediately to your finger to pull away. So it doesn't even involve your brain. It's a reaction that is part of your reflex in your spinal cord. Your body protects itself without even using its brain. So next time you put your finger in a flame and your hand flinches and pulls away, your brain wasn't even involved. It was your spinal cord that sent the message to pull back. Isn't that cool? I think that's pretty cool. That's the reflex arc is where you have a sensory neuron, and it's called the afferent neuron. It carries information from your senses to the nervous system. The motor neuron is the messages that come from your central nervous system to different muscles of the body. That's called the efferent neuron. To help you understand this, the afferent access the spinal cord, AA, where the efferent neurons exit the spinal cord to your muscles, EE, efferent. Okay. Now, interneuron is a neuron found in the center of the spinal cord that receives information from the sensory neurons and sends commands to the muscles through the motor neurons. Interneurons make a bulk of the neurons in the brain as well. Neuroplasticity is the ability to constantly change both the structure and function of the cells in response to experience or trauma. It's also transplanting stem cells have shown helpful in repairing damaged or diseased brain tissue, which shows the ability of our neural system to heal itself. The peripheral nervous system involves all the nerves and neurons that are not contained in the brain and spinal cord, but run through the body itself. And it's divided into the somatic nervous system. Soma means body, so it's the sensory pathway and the motor pathway. So those are the nerves that control voluntary muscles of the body. So the somatic nervous system is when I decide to get up and walk around, it sends nerves to my muscles to move. The automatic nervous system has to do with involuntary muscles like organs and glands. For instance, I don't have to tell my heart to beat or my lungs to breathe. That's an automatic involuntary system, which is a good thing. The peripheral nervous system throughout the body. It's everything except the brain and the spinal cord is the peripheral nervous system. Again, we talked about the somatic nervous system, which involves the sensory pathways. Okay, and also our motor pathways. The autonomic nervous system has to do with our involuntary muscles and glands. We talked about that already. This is good to know, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. This has to do with fight or flight. So let's say I'm in danger. Part of the ANS system is responsible for reacting to stressful events and body arousal. Parasympathetic division is the part that restores the body to normal functioning after arousal. This is important to know, and we'll probably talk more about this, the fight or flight mechanism that kicks in, and how that comes to play. Now, for instance, during what's called the sympathetic division, this shows exactly what happens. The pupils dilate. So when a person senses danger or extreme stress or excitement, the pupils dilate and inhibits the tear glands. It decreases salivation. It increases your heart rate, dilates the bronchi, so you can take in more oxygen. It decreases digestive functions and inhibits bladder contraction. Where once you relax again, the pupils constrict and increases salivation, slows your heart rate down again, constricts your bronchi, and increases digestive functions, restores it back to normal, allows bladder contraction. This is important to know that students who experience a lot of trauma, you've heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, they're pretty much in this phase most of the time, and it causes a lot of other chronic disease. Now, the endocrine glands are glands that secrete chemicals that are called hormones directly into the bloodstream. These chemicals are released by the endocrine glands, which is the same thing. The glands have to do with the pineal gland, pituitary gland, parathyroid gland, thyroid gland, pancreas, adrenal glands above your kidneys, and your ovaries or testes, depending if you're male or female. This kind of explains how each gland secretes different hormones and what they do. So, and I'm going to kind of skip over this. Adrenal glands are important. That's secreted during the time of stress, and that's what causes what's called the general adaptation syndrome, where there's 3 stages of the body: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. For instance, in the alarm stage, the sympathetic nervous system is activated by your adrenal glands. Your muscles contract, sugar is released into the blood system, accelerated heart rate, breathing is frequent, blood pressure is high, hormones are released into the bloodstream. After a while, the liver runs out of sugar, and then you have what's called the exhaustion stage. It's prolonged muscle tension, which causes fatigue. But your body gives you signs that you're tired. This shows an example of general adaptation syndrome. You have the shock, the normal level of resistance to stress, and then exhaustion. The immune system in stress, short-term stress actually boosts your immune system. Cells, organs, and chemicals of the body respond to attacks from diseases, infections, and injuries. However, long-term stress decreases the immune system. The term psychoneuroimmunology is the study of the effects of psychological factors on the immune system. Heart disease, the stress puts people at higher risk for coronary heart disease. Stress can cause diabetes. I know a young lady who was assaulted and raped, and it brought about type 2 diabetes. It occurs when insulin levels become less efficient as the body size increases. Also caused by weight gain too. Cancer, stress increases malfunction of natural killer cells that suppress viruses and destroy tumor cells. And this just kind of shows how a lot of stress can cause a lot of unhealthy behaviors and physiological reactions. Heart disease, stress puts people at higher risk for heart disease. This is kind of what we talked about already. Clinical studies, there's different ways we can study the brain. One is called transcranial magnetic stimulation, and that's where magnetic pulses are applied to the cortex, positioned over the head. Repetitive TMS, transcranial direct current stimulation, human brain damage. A couple things I want to talk about that one. Where's that? My notes. Here it is. There's something called lesioning studies with animals where they actually put in a electrical wire and they cut off certain parts of the electrodes to stimulate brain activity. There's a lot of different ways to study cognition using these methods. There's also what's called the CT scan to image the brain using x-rays of the brain. There's what's called the MRI, which is magnetic resonance imaging. Uses brain imaging method to using radio waves and magnetic fields. This is an example of the CT scan. There's what's called the EEG, which records electrical activity of the brain in different parts of the skull. There's magnetic encephalography, and then there's what's called a PET scan, positron emission tomography. It involves radioactive sugars injected into the subject, and the computer compiles a color-coded image of the brain. Darker colors involve more activity. Lighter colors indicate more activity. The mapping function using a PET scan or MRI over time can look at what's called a functional MRI, looks at the activity over time, and it shows mapping brain function over time. This shows PET scans over time. There's different structures of the brain. There's the medulla, hippocampus, pituitary gland, hypothalamus, the corpus callosum, cerebral cortex, the thalamus, the cerebellum, the pons, and reticular formation. If you want, you can go ahead and read all those and learn more. I also had some other videos that go into this in more detail. But the hindbrain involves the medulla, which is a large swelling at the top of the spinal cord, forming the lowest part of the brain. And that they take care of life functions such as breathing, swallowing, heart rate. The pons is the largest swelling above the medulla, and takes part in playing a part in sleep, dreaming, right body coordination, and arousal. The reticular formation is responsible for selective attention. Cerebellum is lower brain located behind the pons. It controls and coordinates involuntary, rapid, and fine motor movement. This kind of just shows the different parts of the brain. The limbic system. I'm not going to read all this, but the hypothalamus is responsible for motivational behavior, such as sleep, hunger, thirst. So if you're hungry or thirsty, that's how hypothalamus kicking in. The hippocampus is responsible for long-term memory and storage of memory and location. So this is like our hard drive, our hippocampus. The limbic system involves the amygdala, responsible for fear responses and memory of fear. The cingulate cortex plays important roles in cognitive emotional processing, so our feelings. The cortex, responsible for the thought processes. Corticalization. It allows a large area of cortical cells to exist in a small place inside the skull. There's two hemispheres of the brain, which really does not decide if you're right or left-handed. The corpus callosum is a thick band of neurons that connects the right and left cerebral hemispheres. This just talks about the lobes of the brain. The occipital lobe involves the primary visual cortex, in other words, your visual vision. Your parietal lobes basically is responsible for processing information from the skin, such as touch, temperature, body position, and taste. This just shows the different senses that come from different parts of the body, parts of the brain. And the temporal lobes has to do with processing auditory information, or what you hear. Your frontal lobes, this has to do with more of your sending motor commands to the muscles. And then association areas, responsible for coordination, interpretation, and higher mental processing. Broca's aphasia, it's a condition resulting from damage to the Broca's area. It causes the affected person to be unable to speak fluently. Wernicke's aphasia, it causes the affected person to be unable to understand meaningful language. Spatial neglect results in the inability to recognize objects or body parts in the left visual field. The cerebellum is the upper part of the brain, and it involves both hemispheres. With split brain research, people with a severed corpus callosum, they involve sending messages to only one side of the brain, which kind of shows some left and right brain specialization. The left hemisphere controls the right hand, believe it or not. Spoken language, written language, math calculations, logical thought, analysis of detail, and reading, where the right hemisphere is lit up more with nonverbal, visual, spatial, music, emotional thought, processing as a whole, pattern recognition, and facial recognition. So the left and right brain have different functions. Now ADHD have highlighted the likelihood of more than one cause. Current research is looking at a variety of areas, including environmental factors, low-level lead exposure, genetic influences, heredity and familial factors, and personality factors that lead to ADHD. That's the end of the show. Have a great week.